Christmas Eve should have been a time for celebration, but the night began with an unease I couldn't shake. The fire in the hearth danced warmly, yet the shadows it cast felt darker, deeper, as if they had weight. My wife, Emma, bustled about the kitchen, humming a Christmas carol, while our 2 children, Ellie and James, were sprawled on the rug, enthralled by a puzzle. We had moved into Wintershade Cottage just weeks before, drawn by its old-world charm. The stone walls whispered of history, the wooden beams creaked like an old storyteller, and its isolation from the bustle of city life promised peace. Yet tonight, the peace felt more like a void, a silence that carried an unspoken warning. At precisely midnight, the stillness shattered. Doom. The sound reverberated through the air, low and sonorous, as though a bell of immense size had tolled somewhere far away. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of my armchair. Emma paused mid-step, her hum fading into the quiet. The children sat up, their wide eyes mirroring the unease I felt. "What was that?" Ellie whispered. Emma forced a smile. Probably the wind playing tricks with the old stone walls. But I wasn't convinced. The sound was too distinct, too deliberate. I stepped out onto the porch, the cold biting through my sweater. The night stretched out before me, black and starless, the trees at the edge of the property standing like sentinels. There was no wind, no movement, just that oppressive silence. And then it came again. Dome. This time, I thought I saw something. A faint glimmer deep within the woods, like a firefly's glow, but steadier, pulsing in time with the bell. I strained my eyes, but the light faded as quickly as it had appeared. I went back inside, brushing off the chill. Emma had put the kids to bed, though I could hear James asking her questions through the thin walls. I didn't tell her about the light. She already thought I was being paranoid about the house. No need to feed that fire. But as I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, I couldn't help but feel that the night had shifted in some fundamental way, that Wintershade Cottage had been waiting for something, and it had arrived. By the 3rd night, the bell had become a cruel ritual. Every midnight it tolled, its mournful chime slicing through the stillness. Emma had stopped trying to explain it away, and the kids were no longer curious. They were afraid. James slept with the blankets pulled over his head, while Ellie clutched her stuffed rabbit like it was her lifeline. I wasn't faring much better. The sound had begun to feel personal, like it was meant for us alone. And worse, it wasn't just a sound anymore. On the 4th night, as the bell rang, a strange draft snaked through the house. It was icy and carried with it a faint metallic smell. I checked every window, every door, but none were open. When I returned to the living room, Emma was staring at the frost patterns on the window. "Look," she murmured, pointing. The frost had formed shapes, vague and jagged, like clawed hands reaching upward. "I think we should leave," she said, her voice trembling. I wanted to agree, but something deep inside me resisted. Leaving felt like surrendering to whatever was out there. So instead, I stood my ground, promising Emma I would get to the bottom of it. On the 6th night, I ventured into the woods. I told Emma I was going to the shed to check the generator, but instead, I followed the faint path that led into the forest's edge. The air grew colder with each step, my breath curling into frost in the light of my lantern. The bell tolled again, closer now, its vibration rattling through my chest. Ahead, I saw the light, the same pulsing glow I'd glimpsed on the 1st night. As I approached, the light grew brighter, revealing a large, ancient bell suspended between 2 gnarled trees. It was blackened with age, its surface covered in strange runes that shimmered faintly in the dark. And then, to my horror, it moved. Not the wind, not a trick of the eye. The bell tilted, its clapper swaying back and forth, though no hand touched it. The sound it produced was deafening, each toll accompanied by a whisper that scraped at the edges of my mind. I turned and ran, the whispers following me all the way back to Wintershade Cottage. I didn't tell Emma what I'd seen. I didn't have to. The shadows on the walls that night were enough to convince her that we were no longer alone. By the 7th night, the toll of the bell brought more than just sound. It brought movement. Shadows flickered unnaturally on the walls of Wintershade Cottage, twisting in ways that defied the warm glow of the fireplace. The children stopped asking questions. Now they just stared at the corners of their rooms, their small bodies stiff with fear. Emma insisted we leave that night. She packed bags in a frenzy, her hands shaking as she shoved clothes into a suitcase. "We can't stay here, Nathan," she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. "This house isn't safe." She wasn't wrong, but when I tried to open the front door, it wouldn't budge. The knob was cold to the touch, almost as if it had been frozen shut from the inside. I yanked harder, but it didn't give. The windows, too, were sealed, the glass rimed with frost so thick it felt like ice. "It's the storm," I lied, though the night outside was still and soundless. "Maybe tomorrow." The bell tolled then, cutting me off mid-sentence. Its mournful chime resonated through the house, each note louder than the last. Emma froze, her eyes wide, as the frost on the windows began to spread inward, crawling along the walls like skeletal fingers. "Do you hear that?" Ellie whispered from the staircase. Before I could answer, the whispers began again. They came from nowhere and everywhere, a chorus of guttural voices muttering in a language I couldn't understand. I grabbed the fire poker from the hearth and stood in the middle of the room, turning in frantic circles as the shadows on the walls grew darker, deeper. One of them moved. At first, I thought it was a trick of the firelight, but then I saw it, a long, spindly hand emerging from the shadow near the staircase. It wasn't human. Its fingers were too long, its nails sharp and glinting like black glass. Ellie screamed, and the hand recoiled, disappearing back into the darkness. That night, none of us slept. We huddled in the living room, the fire roaring as we tried to keep the shadows at bay. But even with the light, the darkness seemed to press in, heavy and alive. And through it all, the bell tolled, its sound wrapping around the house like a noose. By the 9th night, I was desperate. The whispers were constant now, a low drone that filled every room. The frost had overtaken the walls, the windows, and even the floorboards, leaving the entire house cold and slick. The children were pale and silent, their eyes sunken as if the house was draining the life from them. Emma stopped speaking altogether, her hands trembling whenever the bell tolled. I knew I had to do something. As midnight approached, I slipped out of the house, armed with the fire poker and a flashlight. I followed the faint path into the woods, my breath clouding the frigid air. The bell began to toll as I reached the clearing. Dome. The sound was deafening, and the whispers rose in volume, surrounding me like a swarm of insects. There it was again. The bell. Hanging between the same gnarled trees, its runes glowing faintly in the darkness. But this time, I saw more. Around the bell, figures began to emerge from the shadows. They weren't human, at least not anymore. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, and their bodies twisted as if they'd been broken and reassembled. One of them stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. It pointed a bony finger at me, and the whispers converged into a single word. "Stay!" I stumbled back, raising the fire poker defensively. The figures didn't follow, but the bell tolled again, its sound vibrating through my chest. I fell to my knees, clutching my ears as the whispers filled my mind, showing me fragments of the past. I saw Wintershade Cottage, but not as it was now. The walls were pristine, the frost absent. Inside, a family sat by the fire. A man, a woman, and 2 children. But their faces were etched with fear, their eyes darting to the windows as the bell tolled outside. The vision shifted. I saw the same family, their bodies pale and lifeless, frost creeping over their skin. Their hollow eyes stared at nothing as they sat frozen in their chairs. And then I saw the bell, its runes burning brighter as the figures of the family rose from their chairs, their movements stiff and unnatural. I knew then what had to be done. The bell wasn't just an object. It was a beacon, a doorway, and it had claimed others before us. The vision ended, and I found myself lying on the frozen ground. The figures were gone, but the bell remained, tolling relentlessly. I stood shakily, gripping the fire poker as I approached the ancient object. The runes seemed to pulse as if they were alive, but I didn't hesitate. With all the strength I could muster, I swung the fire poker against the bell, shattering its clapper. The tolling stopped instantly, replaced by a deafening silence. The air grew warmer, and the frost began to melt. But as I turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly defeated it, that I had only delayed the inevitable. We didn't wait for morning. With the bell's silence came a fragile sense of relief, but the house still felt tainted. We threw essentials into bags, barely speaking, and ushered the children into the car. The frost had vanished from the walls, the whispers gone, but the shadows seemed to linger, watching as we fled. The road away from Wintershade Cottage stretched long and dark, the trees closing in like skeletal arms. I drove with one eye on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the bell's glowing runes chasing us. But the night stayed still, the oppressive quiet broken only by the hum of the engine. Hours passed, or so it felt. The children slept fitfully in the back seat, their small faces pale and drawn. Emma gripped my hand tightly, her knuckles white. Neither of us spoke, too afraid to disturb whatever fragile boundary we had crossed. Then, just as the first rays of dawn began to bleed into the horizon, it came again. Doom. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I felt it more than heard it, a low vibration that settled deep in my chest. I froze, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. Emma turned to me, her eyes wide with fear. "Nathan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's still there." I slammed the brakes, the car skidding to a halt on the icy road. The children stirred in the back, their small voices groggy with fear. "Why did we stop?" Ellie asked, clutching her stuffed rabbit. I didn't answer. I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting my skin, and stared back down the road. The forest was silent, the shadows long and still. There was no sign of the bell, no glow, no movement, and yet I knew it was there. The faint toll came again, softer this time, almost mocking. "Doom." The children began to cry. Emma begged me to get back in the car, her voice frantic, but I couldn't move. My eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the road disappeared into the trees. For just a moment I thought I saw them, the figures from the woods, standing at the edge of the forest, watching, waiting. The bell tolled one last time, louder than before, and I knew then that we hadn't escaped. Wintershade Cottage wasn't just a house. It was a mark, a curse that would follow us no matter where we went. We were theirs now, forever.